Dragger, an original novel by Robert Napier, narration and images powered by AI. Chapter 13, First Taste of Freedom. They had ridden out past noon. Now it was getting late. The time and distance didn't add up. They were certain Gnarlstead lay just ahead, and yet nothing seemed familiar. The Gore slowed his pace, and his ears swiveled in the mist. Sounds came from everywhere and nowhere. Shrill shrieks and the sharp clang of bronze bounded around them. A kind of music, muted but distinct, seemed to surround them. Bludge halted. There were voices, calling and singing, harsh and husky, mingling and sinking. "What is it?" Agatha asked at last. "A song," said Murmur. "What should we do?" "We ride on." Bludge spurred the Gore, and they pushed forward, all but blind through the fog. The eerie sounds rose to great intensity and quickly drowned away, as if carried farther and farther into mysterious oblivion that nonetheless lay near at hand. Dex couldn't bear to look, not that there was anything to see, but the sound haunted her, and she felt inextricably drawn toward it, and as if by magic, the mist began to clear as they surmounted a gentle incline. Bludge steered the Gore up a hill to rise above the curtain, though this meant they were more or less lost, for they had not come this way before. It was the firelight that brought them to the place. A bonfire was burning in the twilight. It sizzled as it struggled against the moist evening air and damp logs. The smoke rose in great continuous plumes into the sky. "Just as we saw the night before," said Cringe, "but this fire is fresh." "It could not have been started by the Sawjaws," said Murmur. "They're dead, probably half covered in leech moss by now." Graven was ready to voice his misgivings about navigating the moors when dark silhouettes materialized right in front of them. Bludge reined in the Gore and prepared to turn. They were dreamlike in the firelight, coming slowly from the mist. The Callows drew their weapons, but did not dismount. Dex squeezed against Graven's body, her nerves too twisted to act. The strange music emanated from all around, low and menacing, with a crash of gongs. "They say the bogs are filled with bones from centuries past," chattered Agatha, "and only ghosts can walk on the sucking ground." The gruesome figures closed in, a full encirclement. One stood almost in the bonfire, with a heavy cloak and hood, too damp to sway in the wind, draped over him. He was nearly as big as Dragger himself. A hooked, pointed pole arm, the dreaded blade of the river peoples, rested over his shoulder, glinting. "They're not ghosts," wailed Cringe. "They're demons." "Shut up," growled Bludge. "They're not bloody demons." "How do you know?" he shot back. "Because demons don't smell like armpits and cheap rum." The tall figure laughed, rolling back his hood. He was rough and bearded. "They told me war ghouls were smart. Not smart enough, though. We were just supposed to distract you, throw you off the track. That's all. But after what you did back there, well, you're pirates," said Agatha, a little slower than the rest. Bludge looked around. He couldn't guess how many Rillers were hiding out of sight. The bonfire made it impossible to see through the night and fog. It was a classic strategy to hide their numbers, but even if it was just a ruse, there were still too many to fight with what he had. Cringe, Murmur, and Agatha were on foot between the two Gores. They were the easiest targets. He knew he could charge through and get clear, but if the others scattered, they would be lost. If he stayed to fight, they would all be cut down by the pirates, but would take several with them. "Not so tough now, huh, boss man?" said the demon pirate ghost. Dex felt no sympathy for Bludge, or even fear for herself. When the odds were with them, they were cruel and violent and killed without worry. Now that the odds were against them, what could they say? What could they ask for? "Lord Dragger," began Bludge, but was cut short by a belly laugh that spread through the circle. "Your daddy bag man don't scare us, kiddo. Now that I look at you, I don't reckon you're war ghouls at all. You're just babies. Am I right?" "We are the children of," began Bludge again, but the Riller blatantly interrupted him. We don't want to kill babies, you understand. We're willing to let you go, even though you crashed our little party. But there's one thing you got to do first." "We don't bargain," said Bludge. "You haven't even heard it yet," said the bearded man, visibly flabbergasted at the affront to his generosity. "Let's get out of here," said Cringe. "We have to fight," barked Graven. "War ghouls never run, never surrender." Dex was proud of Graven. He had courage. He believed. He gave her confidence in all she had learned and suffered for. She had been taught since birth, or whatever you called it, that you had to fight for everything, and only Father could tell a war ghoul what to do, not this pirate trash. And maybe she wasn't a war ghoul yet, but these were her brothers and sisters. She had to do what they did, or she was nobody, and she was certain somehow, some way, they would fight. Maybe they wouldn't win, but they would be avenged. That's what family means, that you were all in it together, life or death. You never give up. You never run from danger or pain. That's why they all stayed here and now and at Gnarlstead, despite the harsh punishments and endless training. That's what it meant to be one of Drager's children. They were followers of the true law of the cosmos: family, strength, obedience, and courage. "We have to fight," growled Graven again. But again, there was an interruption. Thwack! An arrow went straight through his temples. His body turned to porridge, and he slumped over the gore's back. Dex was still clinging to him when he toppled down with a wet thud. Bludge whipped around, but it was impossible to tell where the arrow came from. Once more, he counted. Cringe, Murmur, and Agatha, there on the ground. Graven and Dex were out of sight on the other side of the gore. Maybe Dex was dead too, but she was no use in a fight anyway. Cringe looked up at him, his face sallow and his head shaking. He could read the situation too. There was no strategy, fight or run. Ixulingo tightened her arms around Bludge's waist. It was a signal he understood. He didn't look back. He spurred the gore hard, and it sprang into a canter. The shadows of Rillers dove out of its path. He leaned into the gore's hump as Swango leaned against him. They bounded over small boulders and bog pits, the tall grass cutting at their calves. They couldn't see at all, but gave themselves entirely to the gore's survival instinct. They heard shouts and steel rattling after them, but it faded all too quickly. Dex was walking at dawn. That's where she found herself, after a long search through stars and strange battlements, drawing themselves in reds and purples against a night sky that sucked her forward through time. She was dizzy and sweating, and the taste of vomit lingered in her throat. The palm of her hand was throbbing now, sore and raw, pulsing, tender to her touch, and deliciously disproportionate in her mind. Somewhere in the morning mist, her own voice and the voice of Vegas circled like gothawks. Venom divine. I can taste it. Ixwakiri, moon, and heart. I don't know what it's like. Freedom. Somehow she had wandered down into a shallow crevasse where she couldn't see anything despite the morning light. She wasn't surprised to find herself alone and confused. That was pretty normal. But how long had she been gone from herself? And what had happened while she was away? Determined not to panic, she scuttled up a mossy rock face. She stopped to catch her breath and scanned the moors. While the ground was mostly flat, the many protruding ridges and boulders interrupted her sightline. She knew someone was nearby, and it wasn't herself anymore. She turned. Something huge moved in front of her. Before she could react, a gruesome riverine raider loomed over her. The towering man swung down his polearm. Dex rolled backwards out of range. She scrambled until she remembered the sentry's sword as the hilt jabbed her in the back. It was useless now, because she was lying on it. The sinister raider, the same bearded man from the night before, stood over her with his weapon raised. Then, darkness. A coarse sack engulfed her head and instantly tightened under her chin, pulling her up and back. Her fingers scratched at the covering, while her feet flailed like a landed fish. Her own breath was hot on her cheeks. Through the thick fibers of the sack, she could only see shadows passing over her. Strong hands drug her to her feet and forced her wrists behind her back. She was bound tightly around the waist and arms with steady expertise. Her body ached to fight, but there was no leverage and no slack. She was helpless as the big man tossed her over his shoulder like a bag of radishes. Dex was quiet for a long time. She was sat atop a brisk-stepping runka behind the rider. From the room in the saddle, she could tell the rider was relatively small, possibly a woman. They didn't speak at all, but seemed to be making haste across the moors. By looking downward, Dex could see through the worn threads of the sack that had been cinched over her head. She watched the ferns pass by. She kept waiting for Aunt Ruby to jump out from behind the rocks, followed by war ghouls, Vago, and Father himself. No one escapes Gnarlstead, and certainly no one kidnaps a war ghoul. It was only a matter of time before her family came for her. Family was everything. But several miles had gone by, and it never happened. Then she had a thought she hadn't dared to think in a very long time. Maybe she didn't have to go back. Not that she wanted to leave her family, but being kidnapped and everything. It wasn't her fault. She had fought them. Honest, she did. But there were at least 3 or 5 of them, and they were big too. If it wasn't her fault, could anyone blame her for being kidnapped? There was only one thing to do. She had to make some effort to escape. She had to make more effort. She couldn't expect her family to rescue her if she wasn't willing to take a few risks herself. And if that didn't work, well, what else could she do? After a couple deep breaths, Dex hurled herself sideways. She came easily out of the saddle and wriggled in midair. She could barely see the ground and had no hands to put out for safety. Whump. She bounced off the soggy ferns and rolled alongside the runka. She remembered to exhale before hitting, but she fell fully onto her shoulder. All the sores and bruises from her fight with Vago stung like new as she lay in the mud. She tried to stand, but had never realized how hard it was without arms. In mere moments, she was surrounded again. Dex wriggled and writhed, using her hips to flop up and down and scoot any way she could, as long as it wasn't the way they were trying to move her. Several hands clutched her, pushing and pulling, until she was sitting on her butt. With a rush of cool air, the sack was pulled off her head. "I'll fight you," Dex howled. Father always said that threats should be plausible. I'll bite your fingers off." This was before she realized who she was talking to. A woman appeared over Dex. Her tan face, bronzed by exotic climates, was offset by penetrating eyes and whitish blonde hair. Captain Losano squinted as she scrutinized the pig farmer. "Rest easy, sister. You've had a big day. You're lucky you're still breathing." Losano, what the hell?" "Sorry about the sack. Boo here thought you were a spy." Kochaba, Boo, was a large, burly man. Dex had seen him occasionally when Lo visited at Gnarlstead, but she hadn't had a chance to recognize him. "I'm not a spy," groaned Dex, remembering how pointless the denial was. "The Junlands ain't no place for a picnic. What were you doing out here?" She shook her head and went on. "Aunt Ruby sent us." And then Shover followed the Sawjaws, and Ixolingo went fucking crazy, and Vegas bit me, and I'm pretty sure Graven is dead, and I hit my head, and you scared the crap out of me. Whoa, slow down," insisted Lo. "Why did Ruby send you?" Dex had completely forgotten about the runaways. "Oh, a rascally slave. He said he's looking for someone. He claims to be looking for Trek. Something. Dweller. Something. Do you know what he's talking about?" Lo pondered this for a moment. Commander Dweller. Not many around here would mention that name. Especially what do you call yourselves, gnarlies, ghoulies? Dex felt that Lo did not believe what she was telling her. "I'm telling the truth." "I know him," insisted Dex proudly. "Well, of course. I know him too. That's why I'm here. Remember, I told you I made friends in Gurgakol? Lo bent her head to the left. All this time, Dex hadn't realized that the missing slave, Rowan Walker, was standing beside her. Dex had to blink her eyes. Then you're not crazy? Rowan returned a non-committal nod. Lo looked up at the overhanging sky. I think we better get moving. Dex struggled to sit up straight, still tied at the wrists, but her shoulder ached. Arlu clapped her hands softly to get their attention. For the first time, Dex saw Arlu holding the reins to her own runka. Can you stand? Asked Lo. We've got to get out of here before the Gnarlies come looking for us. No, I should stay here, said Dex shyly. Lo helped Dex to her feet as Kochaba untied her bonds. Arlu watched nervously. Sensing something, Lo perked up like a hind. We can talk about it later, sister. We better scoot. Dex did not want to spend another night on the open moor, especially alone, waiting for a rescue that might never find her. She slowly agreed to go with Lo a little further.
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe.